we had a barn in the back of our home property, and there was a fire. Mother said that a good many people thought that since Dad was in politics at the time, somebody had set fire to it. And Dad had 2 horses that were burned in the fire. Took him a long time to recover from that. Long time. Because anybody who's a good man, a good person, loves his animals. And you know, they have the societies for the prevention of cruelty to animals. You don't need a society for that if you love the Lord, because God just shows you instinctively that you're to be kind to animals. Job's loss of possessions also included the loss of his servants. A good man like Job loves his servants almost as much as he loves his own children. And Job's servants were slain with the sword. I like to parallel that with the wonderful servants God gave us during my childhood days. When I tell you that we had servants in the home, that doesn't mean we were plutocrats, anything like that, but my dad was away in Congress a good deal of the time. See, he was in Congress from 1910 to 1920 during World War I. And since that was true, Congress was in special session most of the time. So Dad was away. And since he was away, we felt the need of having a grown man on the property to take care, help Mother and so forth. So these dear people, one was an Indian, she was an Indian, and the other, he wasn't black, but I'm just not sure. They never felt like Indians or anything else to me. We just loved them so much. Tom and Ellen, we called them, Mr. and Ms. Thomas Mathis. And they were just a part of the family. I just could imagine them being slain with the sword and what it would have meant to us. You see, Job lost his servants who were brutally handled by the enemy. Please be sure to remember that Job's first recorded words were in chapter 1, verse 21, "Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Now remember, he didn't say, "The Lord gave, and the devil hath taken away. Cursed be the name of the devil." Of course, there's a real sense in which that was true. He didn't say that. He said, "The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." When I think of Job 1:21, I also think of Hebrews 10:34. Hebrews 10:34 says, "Ye took joyfully the spoiling of your possessions." You know, sometimes you can build up a martyr's idea in your own mind and think, well, I'd be willing if someday the enemy would come persecuting me for Christ's sake, and then I'd be able to take joyfully the spoiling of my possessions. But often God doesn't ask us to bear the ultimate in these things, but to bear the intermediate, things that lead up to that. And I remember how that verse met my need on one occasion. "You took joyfully the spoiling of your own possessions." We had quite a snowstorm in Columbia. I think it was in that year when we had 14 inches in Columbia, very unusual. And the paper boy didn't deliver my paper. He said he did, but he didn't. He just threw it down the snow, and he ruined it. And I thought, well, should I report him? You know, this whole idea of reporting people. Now, I can see when you're in a school situation and other people are involved, you may need to report them. But generally speaking, I leave that alone. That reporting people for what they've done and all like that. And this verse just came to me. "You took joyfully the spoiling of your own possessions." I thought, well, now, I'm not a martyr for the sake of Christ. And that paper boy is not persecuting me for Christ's sake. He's just persecuting me because he doesn't want to come all the way up here and deliver the paper in the right way. And often the lesser kind of trial is the greater trial because it's harder to recognize God's hand in it. But of course, Job certainly recognize God's hand in this, which was not a lesser trial. The Lord gave, the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. That's the first kind of suffering, and you may be called of God to undergo that. The loss of possessions. That comes in different ways. Maybe your salary is cut off. Many other ways. But can you say, the Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away? Blessed be the name of the Lord. The second kind of suffering is in chapter 1, verses 18 and 19. Thy sons and thy daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness. I don't know just what we would call it, a hurricane or a tornado or a cyclone. Those are words that we often use, and there are technical differences between them, but they give you the same basic idea. And there came a great wind from the wilderness and smote the four corners of the house, and it fell upon the young men, and they're dead. The word men here, young men, means young people. See, there were 7 sons and 3 daughters. I used to read that, and I thought, well, weren't the girls also destroyed, killed through the cyclone that came? Surely it's the generic use, as we would say, they fell upon the young people. You know the expression we often use, all men everywhere. Well, when we say all men everywhere, we include the women. But that's the generic use of the word. The second kind of suffering is the loss of loved ones. Do you realize that the sufferings of those you love is a very intense form of suffering for you? Especially is it true when you're not sure how much these loved ones suffered before they died. 7 sons and 3 daughters. The question would naturally come to Job, how much did my children suffer before they died? He didn't know, but all that would go over and over in your mind. The loss of loved ones and the suffering of those who are very dear to you. You know, another question comes to my mind, how many of Job's grandchildren were left behind? You see, these were grown children, and the Bible doesn't tell us about their families, doesn't have to. But 7 sons and 3 daughters, they were grown, and how many children did they have, did they leave behind? We don't know. But the loss of loved ones is the second thing, and ultimately every Christian is called to this if he lives for any length of time. I remember in my own family connection, we were very close in our family and very close to our cousins and all. Now, not very close to Dad's cousins. At one time in my father's life, he had 100 living first cousins. 100 living first cousins. I had only 5 first cousins in all. You know, had 100 living first cousins. Well, we were very close. And I remember when I was in my senior year at the Bible college, I was told to come to the lobby in the main building, and the lady in charge had been told it was a death message. So she said, you better go in that private phone over there. And she thought it was my father because Dad had had a heart attack before. But it was my uncle who had passed away suddenly. You know, I went in to the phone booth. I was there a very short time. My brother told me that Uncle George had died. I came out, it seemed to me like about a year I'd been in that phone booth. That's the first time God saw fit to break our whole family connection with one of our loved ones dying. And then as the years have gone by, those along the way, and you naturally expect things like that to happen, but you never get accustomed to it, and you're not supposed to get accustomed to it. The loss of loved ones. But the Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Then the third form of suffering is in these many verses at the bottom of the page. The third kind of suffering is the loss of health. And God may call any of us here to that. Undoubtedly in this room there are some who have been called to that to a greater or lesser degree. The loss of health. Notice these words that we've underscored. So went Satan forth from the presence of the Lord and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot unto his crown. His whole body from head to foot was just one festering mass of sores and boils. As you read these things about Job, you'll realize that these were not ordinary boils, Job and his boils. We'll describe this technically as we go along, but this was great suffering in the loss of health. One writer said that if a man has one boil, that boil is enough to engage his attention all the time and to give his whole family employment in waiting on him, if he just has one boil. You know, generally speaking, men can't take pain like this as women can. Often I think that if men had to take responsibility of bringing children into the world, there'd never be more than one child in any family.
Amen.
Because, well, that's the first amen I've had tonight. I don't know whether you'd call that a spiritual one or not. Let you decide. But this was real suffering, folks, in the loss of health. And he took a potsherd to scrape himself withal. A potsherd is a broken piece of pottery. Evidently, he scraped himself because of the intolerable itching that would come, and also because of the matter that was exuding from the sores. This isn't exactly an appetizing description, but it's a very real description. These weren't ordinary boils, I assure you. In order to see the greatness of Job's suffering, note also the following passages. When I lie down, I say, when shall I rise, and the night be gone? And I'm full of tossings to and fro under the dawning of the day. Suffering is unusually severe at night, you know, when you try to go to sleep. I remember in my childhood days, I had very few sleepless nights, but I loved to go barefooted in the summertime. And I'd hate to think I had to do it today, but I'd go barefooted, and nearly always every year I'd develop a stone bruise. And I'd have to go down and have the doctor lance it. And he didn't deaden the thing, I can assure you that. Real suffering, but I was glad to have that done because I went to sleep the next night. But you know, a little child doesn't have many sleepless nights, but I had some sleepless nights with a stone bruise. Well, when you're in physical suffering, the nighttime is unusually severe. And I'm full of tossings. My flesh is clothed with worms and clods of dust. My skin is broken and become loathsome. Not only was this suffering painful, but it was also very humiliating. My flesh is clothed with worms and clods of dust. My skin is broken and become loathsome. My face is foul with weeping, and on my eyelids is the shadow of death. My bone cleaveth to my skin, and I'm escaped with the skin of my teeth. I think I told you earlier that if you ever use that expression, you're very literary and very historic, because this comes from the oldest book in the world, the book of Job. My bones are pierced in me in the night season, and my sinews take no rest. My skin is black upon me, and my bones are burned with heat. Many Bible scholars think that there's a technical description of Job's boils, Job's loss of health. They call it black leprosy. And Philip Schaff, the church historian, says that the most loathsome form of leprosy is black leprosy, which he had. The technical term they use is elephantiasis gracorum. Let me ask, how many of you have ever seen anybody who had elephantiasis? Just a few. I saw one. It was in my childhood days. I've never seen anybody since, as far as I can recall. And his body was just swollen out of all due proportions. Oh, it was just pitiful looking. See, they call it elephantiasis, like an elephant almost. The swelling comes. But still, he didn't have the same kind of elephantiasis, gracorum, that Job had, with the flesh all becoming black and loathsome. The Bible describes that in great detail. But can you lose your health in a very painful way and in a very loathsome, humiliating way? and still praise the Lord. Job could. I love Job's first two recorded statements. One of his recorded statements was, the Lord gave and the Lord hath taken away, blessed be the name of the Lord. That's chapter 1. And then chapter 2, what shall we receive good from the hand of the Lord, and shall we not also receive evil? In all of this did not Job sin with his lips. Sometimes God has to take health from us in order that we'll appreciate the health we have. Yeah. You take a person who seems very poor and has to pinch the pennies all his life. But if he's in good health, he's rich. I want to tell you, a person can be well-to-do and still have poor health and not be well-to-do in many, many ways. And that's a great test for anybody. When you lose your health, can you still praise the Lord? Spurgeon said that it was a great blessing to him to be sick. He had a great deal of sickness in his life. He used to go to the coast of France on vacation and to rest. As he came closer and closer to 58 years of age when he died, he had a great deal of sickness. And he said he lived to see the time when his heart was just filled with deep gratitude to the Lord, when he could turn over in bed without suffering pain. I thank the Lord, I didn't even suffer pain when I turned over in bed. Well, you see, we just take things like that for granted. Be careful, don't take the Lord's gifts for granted, because he might take them away from you if you take them for granted. All right, that's the third kind of suffering, is the loss of health. Then on page 7, the fourth form of suffering, chapter 2, verse 9. Then said his wife unto him, dost thou still retain thine integrity? Curse God and die. The Hebrew word integrity is translated by some perfection. Some folks say Job must have been a wonderful man because even his wife thought he was perfect. If his wife thought he was perfect, he must really have been a perfect man. I remember my family used to kid me a lot about it. Before Amanda and I were married, she told everybody that she thought I was perfect. Oh, my family let me have that, you know. Yeah, she's marrying a perfect person. You just wait. You just wait. Well, you know, strange thing happened. After we were married, she never accused me of being perfect. And my family was after me. I came back home for the Christmas holidays, and my sister was there, and I was to call her up to talk to her on the phone, and she came to the phone, and this is the way she greeted me. She says, "Oh, hello. Are you still perfect?" And my aunt asked Amanda, said, "You said you thought Frank was perfect. Do you still think that?" And her answer was, "If I'm not, it's my fault. If he's not, it's my fault." See? Got away with it. No, but Job must have been a wonderful husband. His wife talked about his integrity, about his perfection. She said, "Curse God and die." The fourth kind of suffering is the loss of the spiritual help of the life companion. And oh, what a tremendous test that can be. The loss of the spiritual help of the life companion. I've heard people say sometimes you can't really sympathize with people unless you've had that same experience yourself. But I don't agree with that for a minute. I believe that you can sympathize with them by contrast. Whenever I was going through any test, I had my old buddy Love with me. She was rooting for me and pulling for me. In fact, somebody today was talking about her and said, "Love to hear her say amen," when I was teaching. Well, that was partly she was praying for me, and partly she was rooting for me, you know. And whenever I went through tests, I had her there. And now here's some husband whose wife is not a good companion. You say, "I just couldn't appreciate that." Yes, I can by contrast. You can appreciate those things by contrast. You don't have to go through them yourself. But that is a great test for anybody. Very few men are true to the Lord when their wives are not true to the Lord. A great many women are true to the Lord when their husbands are not true to Him. But very few men are true to the Lord when their wives are not. And Job is one of those. He suffered the loss of the spiritual help of his life companion. That's hard to bear at any time, but especially is it hard to bear when the person is going through special sufferings, as Job was going through special sufferings. The fifth kind of suffering is in chapter 2, verses 11 to 13, and these kindred passages. Job's three friends had made an appointment together to come to mourn with him and comfort him. So they sat down with him upon the ground 7 days and 7 nights. And none spake a word unto him, for they saw that his grief was very great. Now notice what I've underscored here. He has put my brethren far from me. Mine acquaintance are verily estranged. My kinsfolk have failed. My familiar friends have forgotten me. My maids count me for a stranger. I called my servant, and he gave me no answer. My breath is strange to my wife. Yea, young children despise me. Now that would be a great insult for us in our western lands, but it's a greater insult for Orientals. One of the simplest ways to insult an Oriental is to have a child insult him. You see, that's true in our land, but even more so with the Oriental idea. What did Job lose? He suffered the loss of his friends and his reputation. To lose your friends is a real test. And one of the greatest tests any man has is the loss of his reputation. You take, this person says his money or his possessions valuable to him. Yeah, but not nearly as much as his reputation. Chapter 13, verse 15, differs in the King James Version from the ASV. In the King James Version, 13:15 says, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Probably some of you are saying that's one of my favorite verses. That's one of my favorite verses as the King James translates it, but probably that is not what Job said. And the reason why we think that's not what Job said, though he slay me, yet will I trust him, is the context of the whole passage. You see, now he's gotten away from that praising the Lord. One thing his friends did to him was to drive him farther away from the Lord. You can do that when somebody's suffering. You can drive him away from the Lord. He started off praising the Lord, and then his friends come along and drive him away from the Lord. Probably what he said was this. This is the way the ASB translates it. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. That's King James. Here's the ASB. He will slay me. I have no hope. Evidently, that's what he said in the context. Now, he'd already said in essence before, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. That's in chapter 1:21. He'd said that in essence. But now, he's away from that attitude. He's away from that attitude. You know, it's a warning here. You can start off in your trials praising the Lord, and then you can end up defending yourself. And that's what Job did. He started off praising the Lord, and then he began to pity himself. And that's what his friends accomplished by their so-called comfort. He lost his friends, and he lost his reputation. The sixth kind of suffering is in chapter 30, verse 10. They abhor me. They stand aloof from me and spare not to spit in my face. Another verse that indicates this is chapter 17, verse 6. Chapter 17, verse 6 mentions the same thing. His suffering was from physical attack. See, if somebody slaps you in the face, you consider that to be a great insult. But it's an even greater insult if he spits in your face. And that's what happened. People literally spat in his face. As you read these debates between Job and his friends, remember there was evidently a great deal of physical movement and physical excitement in these debates. For example, in chapter 18, verse 4, Bildad was talking to Job, and in 18:4 he said, thou that tearest thyself in thine anger, thou that tearest thyself in thine anger. I wasn't in this particular class at Dallas Seminary, but the fellows told me about it. I was there just 2 years, and we had a visiting Bible faculty. Dr. Ironside was a member of the visiting Bible faculty, and he drew certain books that he taught each time, and one was the book of Job. And all the fellows in the class were talking about it. Really, he was very dramatic. He could be dramatic in his preaching, and I mean dramatic in the right way. And they told me that they thought he really could have made a fortune on the stage if he'd wanted to do so. But the fellow said he acted out the attitude of Job and his friends. It was a violent kind of thing. Don't think that one person saying, now, dear Job, let me say this to you in a very kind way. No, a lot of physical movement, a lot of physical excitement. And then they just stood up and spat in Job's face. That is physical attack. I've heard somebody say, I can stand anything, but to have somebody slap me in the face. Well, this is worse than that. To have somebody spit in your face. Great deal of physical movement in it. This is physical attack. And Job suffered from the physical attack. Now look at G. There was another form of suffering which Job was called to undergo that was worse than any of the others. What was it? Now listen while I reread the others and see if you can think of another form of suffering that's not mentioned already. The loss of possessions, the loss of loved ones, the loss of health, the loss of the spiritual help of a life companion, the loss of friends and reputation, suffering from physical attack, and can you think of any other form of suffering?
The Lord didn't seem to be with them at all.
Say that again?
The Lord didn't seem to be, there at all.
Oh, there you are. See, I like the way she expressed it. The Lord didn't seem to be there at all. He was there, but he didn't seem to be there. That's the loss of the sense of God's presence. The loss of the sense of God's presence. Chapter 23, verses 8 and 9 makes that very clear. In chapter 23, verses 8 and 9, Job said, Behold, I go forward, but God is not there, and backward, but I cannot perceive him. On the left hand, when he doth work, but I cannot behold him. He hideth himself on the right hand, that I cannot see him. See, Job said, I look before me and behind me, and God's not there. And I look on the right hand, look on the left hand, he's not there. He was there, but he didn't seem to be there. Now you say, do you as a Christian ever lose the sense of God's presence? There could be two reasons why a person loses the sense of God's presence. One is because there's unconfessed sin in the life. And if there's unconfessed sin in the life, that can cause you to lose the sense of God's presence. But the other reason is to test your faith. To test your faith. And there are a lot of Christians who don't want to have unconfessed sin in their lives. But they lose the sense of God's presence. And they have to think, well, God's gone. No. Remember, let me give you a little diagram like this. Here's the foundation and superstructure that I often mention. Here's the foundation for your peace and rest. It's the fact of God's presence, the unchanging fact. I love to quote Hebrews 13:5, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. And in the Greek, it has 5 negatives. And so I just like to say, I'll never, 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 never leave thee. See, the unchanging fact of God's presence. Then built on that fact is the sense of God's presence. But the resting place of faith is not the sense of God's presence. The resting place of faith is the unchanging fact of God's presence. No matter how I feel, God is here. No matter how you feel, God is here. That's the resting place of faith. And Job really went through this. He lost a sense of God's presence, and he thought he had lost God's presence. He hadn't. He lost the sense of it. But you say, well, does a Christian who's true to the Lord ever lose the sense of God's presence? You take the Apostle Paul. If you want to read a New Testament companion book to Job, you'll find part of it in 2 Corinthians, Paul's sufferings. And Job is sometimes called the world's greatest sufferer. No, I tell you, you can't put him alongside Paul. Paul was a greater sufferer than Job. Job was one of the world's greatest sufferers. Paul was greater. 2 Corinthians, when Paul was going through his different trials, you might say everything was just sort of unruffled with him, and he wasn't really suffering at all. He was above his sufferings. Oh, you read 2 Corinthians, he says, without were fightings, within were fears. And there was a great deal of turmoil in his life. It's often said that the true Christian life is characterized as much by conflict as it is by peace. He had peace, but it was peace in the midst of conflict, in the midst of turmoil. And I hope you'll want to read 2 Corinthians on your own in order to see the New Testament version of this. Canon Howlett was a very godly minister in the Church of Canada. He used to speak at the Ben Lippen conferences. And he gave a testimony one time. It was very real and rich. And at the close of it, Dr. McQuilkin interpreted it and applied it for us. And you see, Dr. Priest used to tell me that when a man is in charge of a conference, he's in charge of that conference, and he's to see to it that that conference moves in the right direction. And Dr. McQuilkin saw to that. And I know his friend Charlie Houston from Augusta. Charlie Houston was a member of the board. And sometimes he'd say to him, Bob, I appreciated all 6 of your sermons this morning. See, he was presiding, and he interpreted it. Canon Howard gave a testimony, and he said for about 6 weeks after he yielded himself completely to the Lord, he just was floating on the clouds. He said it just didn't seem to be an effort to do anything. I was just floating on the clouds for 6 weeks. But then he said, all of a sudden, that feeling left me, and it's never returned. He said many years have passed since then, but that particular feeling has never returned. He didn't mean the Lord hadn't been real to him. The Lord had been real to him, but not that particular feeling. And then, of course, Dr. McQuilkin interpreted it, and I think you could interpret it too. Why did God take that feeling away? You see, there's a special sense of God's presence, but that's not the resting place of faith. The resting place of faith is the unchanging fact of God's presence. You know, there's a book that's often referred to by Christians called Practicing the Presence of God by Brother Lawrence. How many of you have ever seen or read that book, Practicing the Presence of God? I know Dr. Priest up at Ben Lippen was commenting on it once, and he said, others may have gotten something out of that book that I haven't gotten out of it. But he said, frankly, it's just never been much to me, that practicing the presence of God. One thing that makes me cautious about recommending it is that I found Brother Lawrence was a Roman Catholic. Since he was a Roman Catholic, I'm cautious of, I'm not exactly fond of Roman Catholicism. I've hinted at that a time or two, in our classes, that I'm not fond of Roman Catholicism. I thought you'd smile with me on that, but you didn't, but it's okay. You're forgiven. But he said, that just hasn't seemed to meet my need much, practicing the presence of God. No, here's the real secret of trust, the unpracticed presence of God. You say you shouldn't practice His presence. You will when you trust the Lord. But you see, He's here. He's here. It's an unchanging fact. It's an unchanging fact. That's my resting place. That's my resting place. And that's one reason why God takes away the sense of His presence sometimes. It can come because of unconfessed sin and waiting before the Lord to show anything wrong. But often it's just a test of faith. I used to think the best kind of faith comes when you're in a Bible conference or you're in a camp meeting and you're just floating on the clouds and the choir's singing and you just are buoyed up in your Christian life. Well, that's fine when that's God's will, but that's not the highest kind of faith. Highest kind of faith comes when you feel as dead as 12 o'clock. Yeah. And everything seems to go wrong, but you know God is there. Amen. And his name, see if you remember, what's the name used for God about 30 times in the book of Job? He is El Shaddai, the God who is more than enough. Now, look back over those different forms of suffering for a minute, and remember, you may be called of God to go through any of those forms of suffering, or perhaps all of them. As I read them, just ask yourself, as far as you can tell, how many of these different forms of suffering have you gone through thus far? The loss of possessions, the loss of loved ones. You know, somebody might say, I've never lost any possessions because I've never had any possessions to lose, you know. You might say that, but that's losing possessions if you've never had any to lose. And the loss of loved ones, the loss of health, the loss of the spiritual help of a life companion, the loss of friends and reputation, suffering from physical attack, and then loss of the sense of God's presence. I wonder if there's anybody here tonight who's especially gone through that. You know, many Christians have had what they call their dry times. Some of the great saints of God have spoken of what they call their dry times, when everything just seemed to be kind of as dry as dust in your soul. Dry time, and of course, that causes heart searching. Why am I having this dry time? Dr. McQuilkin was a great blessing to me in so many little things he said on the side. We would have our days of prayer, and I'd have the idea, well, then, when he came to the day of prayer, he would just always be fully prepared for the day of prayer. And I remember he told us sometimes, he said, I've come to this day of prayer, and really I just haven't felt prepared for it. I haven't felt prepared for it. Well, you say you couldn't expect anything to happen. Yeah, your expectation is not under your preparation, but it's under the Lord himself. And he said, I'll just go along in faith and just claim God's victory, no matter how I feel about it. The sense of God's presence is wonderful, but the unchanging fact of God's presence is far more wonderful than the sense of his presence. I will never, 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 never leave thee. Hebrews 13, verse 5. On page 8, just look at the C question. Since the first two chapters of Job give a clearer revelation concerning Satan than any other Old Testament scripture, make a detailed study of Satan in this tremendous passage, listing everything you find about this great foe of God and man. You know, the Old Testament tells us very little about the devil in a direct way. Very little. But the first two chapters of Job really let us in behind the scenes. Let me just introduce this study, and then we'll complete it 2 weeks from tonight. I like to surround Satan with these simple questions: who, where, what, when, why, and how. Dr. William Evans wrote a book that Bible Institutes often used in the study of homiletics. Homiletics is preaching principles. And he showed us how he just took a few of these monosyllabic questions, these questions of just one syllable each, and thought his way through his whole sermon with these. Well, let's just begin with the first question: who? Who is this enemy of God and man? And you find that from the names and titles that are used. In the Bible, there are about 35 different names or titles for Satan, about 35. So when you describe him, use one or more of the Bible titles. Don't call him the old boy. Don't call him the booger man. See, those words that are often used. No, not one of those is the old boy or the booger man. God's truth is best expressed in God's own words. And here in this, you have the name Satan that's used. It's used 14 times in these 2 chapters. Who is the devil? He's Satan. He's Satan. And in the Bible itself, 52 times the name Satan occurs. 14 of those are right here in these first 2 chapters of Job. Now, what's the meaning of the word Satan or the word devil? See, Satan is the Hebrew Old Testament form of the word. Devil is the New Testament Greek form of the word. You see, you don't have the word devil in the Old Testament. You may have it in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. But we don't have that word devil in our English Bibles in the Old Testament. It's Satan. That's the Hebrew form of the word. Then in the New Testament we have both, because the word Satan is transliterated, brought over from the Hebrew into the Greek in the New Testament. And then you have your Greek word diabolos. It means Satan. What's the word Satan mean? It means adversary or enemy, but especially adversary or enemy in the sense of the accuser. He's the adversary of God and man. He's the accuser. I like to render it prosecuting attorney. Satan is the prosecuting attorney. He accuses Job to God. He accuses you to the Lord. And he accuses God to Job. He accuses God to you. You see how he often accuses God to you? He says, well, the will of God just isn't perfect. God's a liar. God has said his way is perfect. Y'all know my life verse is Psalm 18:30, as for God his way is perfect, and then verse 32, he maketh my way perfect. But Satan can tell me God's a liar on that. You say, this happens here, now that's not perfect. Yeah, that's perfect. That's perfect. And God's will for you is perfect. Don't try to improve on perfection. You can try to improve on the perfect will of God, but don't try to do it, because it's perfect. See, he accuses God to you, and he accuses you to God. One way he accuses Job to God is he just says, Job loves you because of what he gets out of you. Well, you know how many secular writers say religion is just refined selfishness. That's all it is. It's just refined selfishness. And it's the pie in the sky idea and all, and you just love the Lord because what you get out of him. Well, there's a sense in which your love for the Lord is partly due to what he gives you. See, the psalmist said, I love the Lord because he heareth my supplication. See, and you do love him because of what he gives you. Yeah. But can you love him when he takes away the things he's been giving to you? Well, see, Job is accused by Satan, and God is accused by Satan. You're just a glorified Santa Claus, and you remove these blessings, and he'll curse you to your face. Well, Job's wife tried to get him to do it. She was Satan's emissary, but Job wouldn't do it. The one way in which Satan accuses is he picks at you. And some people have this more than others, but every Christian will have it to some degree. I heard Mr. Legters, the Bible conference speaker, say one time that when God convicts you of sin, he does this. See, and he just can't write like he convicts of sin like this. Satan doesn't do that. Satan picks at you. He just picks at you. God never picks at you. God never picks at you. He convicts, and you know he means business. But Satan picks at you. And a great many Christians undergo that, and they don't realize that it's coming from Satan. But God never picks at you. Yeah. He convicts you in a very clear-cut way. Often after I've finished a class, I didn't do that just the right way at all. Sure, I never do it in just the right way. Yeah. I know that sight unseen. I don't agree with me, brother. You be careful on that. But then Satan can just go picking at you. God doesn't do that. See, that's one way he accuses. He's the accuser of the brethren. This is recorded in the first two chapters of Job. And then Revelation 12, verses 7 to 9, gives that in fully developed form. The last book of the Bible, Revelation 12, 7 to 9. The devil, the accuser, was cast down, Revelation 12, 7 to 9. He that accuseth them before the face of God night and day. God, Satan accuses you before the face of God. And that's where I have the Lord Jesus as my lawyer to defend me. See, 1 John 2, 1 and 2, if any man sin, we have an advocate with the Father, a lawyer with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. And he takes care of all that Satan attacks. But that word Satan is the same as the word devil. One's of the Hebrew of the Old Testament, and the other's the Greek of the New Testament. And they mean adversary, but adversary in the sense of prosecuting attorney, in the sense of the accuser. That's the first question. Who is Satan? The second question, with which we'll close, where is he? Well, you know, we often use the expression, every devil in hell. Every devil in hell. Don't think they're there yet. Satan and his emissaries are going to be cast there. But you see, Satan tells us here where he is. In chapter 1, verse 7, and chapter 2, verse 2, God says, where have you been? And he says, from going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. See, the New Testament calls Satan the god of this world, and it calls Satan the prince of this world. And he says, from going to and fro in the earth and walking up and down in it. He doesn't say, I've come up out of hell for a little time to make it hard for Job. No, he's in the earth. He's the god of this world, and he's the prince of this world. Students of the Hebrew language say that the literal Hebrew here is very strong. From going to and fro in the earth and walking up and down in it. They translate it literally from rushing madly to and fro in the earth. Satan is very busy in the earth. For further details, read your daily newspaper. Yeah. Your daily newspaper will show you he is very busy. Yeah. He's very busy in the earth. Where is he? And then, of course, Job 1 and 2 and Revelation 12, 7 to 9 give us another answer. He has access to the throne of God. That's a great mystery. I don't know all the details about it, but I don't have to know. But I know that greater is he that's in you than he that's in the world. And, you know, I love that passage. I love to use it. I have an object lesson on Satan that I use with the girls and boys, and I like to introduce and end it with 1 John 4:4. Greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. Infinitely greater. 5 times greater, 100 times greater, 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times, 1,000,000,000 times. You know, if I could stand here all night, if I knew enough numbers, I could just keep saying one after the other, and I'll always say more than that. More than that. Infinitely greater is he that's in you than he that's in the world. All right, we'll continue this next time. Let's have our prayer. Now, will you just thank the Lord for every form of suffering you've had in your life thus far. And ask the Lord that you won't miss anything he has for you in any form of suffering. And And then will you thank him that greater is he that is in you, billions of times greater than he that is in the world. In Jesus' name, amen.